Okay, class, this is the video lecture for chapter 23 entitled Musical Sermons, Bach and the Lutheran Cantata. In this chapter, and we're talking about the Baroque period now, from 1600 to 1750. Remember, we say in 1600, the invention of opera occurred, and it influenced all music. Opera, it was an avant-garde art form. And there are two sacred forms that are opera-like. One is the cantata, and the other is the oratorio. We'll do that in another chapter. So this chapter is about the cantata. And the cantata is a word that how you use it has different meanings. So we're talking about the church cantata from the Lutheran Church. And it's very similar, or you could say a parallel to the Mass in the Catholic Church. So in this chapter, we're going to talk about the cantata versus the Mass and Lutheranism versus Catholicism. Let me share the screen for the PowerPoint. And the key points here are the Lutheran musical worship is structured around congregational hymns known as chorales, which are specific to each Sunday service. A chorale is a harmonized piece of music that is not difficult to sing, or not too difficult to sing, and which it promotes everybody in the church to sing it, not just the choir and not just professional singers. The church cantatas of J.S. Bach were mostly written for the Lutheran Church services. They are multi-movement works with solo arias, recitatives, and choruses, all with orchestral accompaniment. So these same elements appear in opera, right? Arias, recitative. Remember, recitative tells the story. It's about reciting in a declamatory style. And the aria is about how I feel about something. And in choruses, everybody's singing. And we're going to sample music from Bach's cantata, Wachet auf, which translates to Sleepers Awake. And he wrote several hundred cantatas, we'll see. Just to compare and point out some of the things that the Lutheranism from Martin Luther, remember he wrote these 95 Theses, at least posted them in 1517, which instigated the start of the Lutheran religion. Some of these elements where they rejected the idea of having a pope and this vertical structure from the priest on up. And by doing this, it was in a way very revolutionary. It's as if the Supreme Court would not rule on the Constitution, but each of us could interpret the Constitution in his own way. The Lutheranism called their leaders ministers and not priests. And of course, the Lutheranism, the ministers could marry, where priests cannot marry. They rejected the idea of confession and priestly absolution in the Catholic Church. When you become a priest, it's a sacrament to become a priest, and you have special powers that if you're not a priest, you do not have. And one of these powers is absolution, where if you confess your sins to a priest, the priest is an intermediary and he can forgive you. Where in the Lutheran Church, the idea was that I don't need a priest to confess my prayers to. I can just talk to God anywhere, right? Immediately, and he will listen to me and I can confess my prayers. And they abandoned the idea of saying masses and prayers for the dead. One of the big things that the Catholic Church was doing at the time was selling, taking money and saying that by giving them money they could forgive you from going to purgatory, and your friends would have that, or your aunts or your relatives might be in purgatory. But if you give us money, I can say special prayers and then take time off of their penance, right? Anyway, these were being taken advantage of by the Catholic Church, and so the Lutheranism, they abandoned these ideas. So in the Lutheranism, they start to say that the church service in the vernacular as opposed to only in Latin. And in the Catholic Church, it was spoken, the Mass was performed in Latin until the 1960s, when the Ecumenical Council, they had a meeting and they decided that any church could decide on what language they wanted to say the Mass in. It didn't have to be in Latin. And of course, it could be in English or Spanish or French or whatever. So they stopped using the plain chant, right, from that we studied from the Middle Ages in the Catholic, that was used in the Catholic Church until the 1960s. When I was a child, the masses were said in Latin, and if you wanted to be participating in the Mass, you had to say the prayers in Latin. So these chorales, or songs that were sung on the message of the day. So on a certain Sunday, you would have certain songs that you would sing called chorales, and they had been used for hundreds of years. Well, at least 150 years, because Bach wasn't born until 1685. And so everybody in the church, from the child until they were old, they sang these same songs. So everybody knew these songs, and it was a connection everybody had with these songs. So Martin Luther said, after theology, I give music the greatest educational importance and highest honor. And so the Lutheran Sunday service, right, like the Catholic Church, had ordinary prayers and proper prayers, right, which were different prayers said every day of the week. If it was Easter Sunday or Good Friday, they would be different prayers. If it was Christmas or the day after Christmas, they would be different prayers if they were the proper prayers. In the Lutheran Church service, they had a certain message and a Bible reading that was to be said on a particular Sunday. And then so the songs that were sung were affiliated with that to get the message across. So a cantata is based on a particular chorale, right, that is usually sung and performed immediately before the sermon. Right, the sermon that the minister would give is a verbal interpretation of the Bible reading. So Martin Luther, 1483, 1546. He was a very important individual because he stood up to the church, to the Catholic Church. And with words and with laws, he defended himself, and he actually won, which was a first. Here is one of the churches that Bach worked at, and we have to say J.S. Bach, really, because Bach had 18 children. He had 2 wives, and I always joke to say, well, the one wife died, and so, well, the second wife died too. But his children, at least 4 of them, were very successful composers and probably more popular than Bach was. And remember, the Baroque started in 1600. In 1750, when Bach died, we say is the end of the Baroque, and his children were writing classical music, the next style period, and you could see where they're saying, Papa, are you still writing that old stuff? So again, the Lutheran cantata is this music for the church service, had solo arias, recitatives, and choruses. And here is J.S. Bach himself. Obviously, this is a wig, right? This was the standard apparel at the time. If you had money and you could afford a wig, you got your head shaved to not have to deal with bugs, and have a wig or two. So again, Bach, 1685, 1750. culminating figure of the Baroque style, right? He was like the high point and the end at the same time. He actually played the organ and was a virtuoso, and he was hired often to travel great distances to churches that had a new organ and where he would tune it and regulate it to work at its best. And he was famous for just sitting down at the organ and improvising music. Of course, Bach wrote not just sacred music. He wrote a lot of secular music, right? He wrote suites, which we'll study in another chapter, concertos, another chapter, sonatas, keyboard music, and I mentioned here the Brandenburg concertos. We'll do concerto another time, but he always wanted to do better things, and he was a stubborn man, and he was in charge in the one city of like 4 churches in the music. And can you imagine to writing a cantata, and which had like 6 or 8 movements, and then having to teach the musicians and then perform it, and doing this 50 or 60 times a year? How did he have time to do this? And he got in an argument with his boss one time and was sent to jail for like 10 days. And he tried to get a job at the city of Brandenburg in Germany. And he wrote 6 concertos, each one with 3 movements, and submitted them to as his resume. And he did not get the job because the music, even though it was spectacular and we considered it amazing music now, at the time it was basically out of style. So he wrote, again, if you wrote one for each Sunday, that'd be 52, and there's some special days you'd have to write one also. So it's like 50 or 60 cantatas a year, and he wrote 4 or 5 cycles, which would be like 200, right? 5 times 50 would be 250. We only have 200. What happened to the other ones? We don't know. And each cantata has 5 to 8 movements. And it's based on a chorale. So here is a parable, right? Story of the wise and foolish virgins. This, I guess, is related to the message in the cantata that we're going to sample. So this cantata, called Wachet auf, right? Sleepers Awake, has 7 movements. And the chorale, right, the tune that everybody sings, was actually written in 1599. Remember, Bach wasn't born until 1685. So this chorale tune by this man, Bach used it in 3 of the movements, of the 7 movements have elements of this music from 1599. So we're going to sample 3 movements from this cantata. The first movement is the chorale Fantasia, which would mean that it's kind of an ornamented version that everybody wouldn't sing, the congregation wouldn't sing. And the 4th movement is called the unison chorale, unison meaning only one music line, and it's sung by the tenors. And the 7th movement is a chorale, which would be something that everybody would sing in the congregation. A couple elements I forgot to mention, or I'd like to mention, about the Baroque style, right? Remember, we said it was initiated by the invention of opera in 1600. And remember, we said that the big change between the Renaissance to the Baroque was the dropping of using multiple voices to carry a message and a melody, to have one singer accompanied by a rhythm section. We said it was called monody. And that rhythm section used a shorthand piece of music that had a bass line with figures that represented intervals underneath it. And we say that was figured bass. and is actually very similar idea to the way music is written now, with chords and a bass line and a melody. One of the other elements that was really popular and used, and I mentioned when we talked about the opera in 1600, was the use of the ritornello, where a melody keeps returning, and it maybe not completely, but little bits of it keep showing up throughout the piece of music, and so we'll hear that in this music, the use of ritornellos. So actually, if you look at this, there are 7 movements here, right? The chorale fantasy, the tenor recitative, an aria by a soprano, a unison chorale, we're going to sample that, a bass recitative, an aria. Notice how you have this coupling of the recitative and an aria. This is typical of opera and also in cantatas, right? So here is the first movement. Notice the choir sings something that keeps changing every time, where the orchestra keeps playing this part that keeps coming back and won't go away, right? Called the ritornello, returning part. All right, now this is number 4. This is called the unison chorale, where the tenors alone sing, and they sing in unison. Again, notice that the voices sing a verse, and then there's the orchestra plays, and then the verse, and then the orchestra plays. And every time the orchestra plays, it's pretty much the same thing, and we call that a ritornello. There we go. Okay, now the last example from the text is the 7th movement from Bach's Cantata number 140. And this is the chorale, again, now in a version where everybody might be able to sing. And by the way, right, one of these services that you went to for the Lutheran Church might last 4 hours or so, including an orchestra and choir, pretty spectacular event. Nevertheless, here is the 7th movement called the chorale. Just to point out, notice that here we are in a church, it's part of the church service, and they're using original instruments, right? Notice this French horn does not have valves because this would be the instrument was used at the time. And the oboes, if you had watched, are different than modern oboes. The strings are not really different than what we use now, but and we would say this is done with an attitude of authenticity. And of course, that part was the chorale that everybody would have known because they would have been singing it at the church since they were a child. And Bach used that to tie the whole thing together, right? Because the chorale is based on the sermon that's supposed to be given on that particular day. And so he writes a piece of music that uses all those elements that's special for that one day. So in reality, you can only perform that cantata one day a year. So that concludes the chapter 23, J.S. Bach and the cantata.